I'm Tory Bowman, and you're watching Underestimated, a show about breaking barriers for people with disabilities. Underestimated is brought to you by Cortree, a division of Spinal Cord Injury Ontario. On today's show, we're discussing aging, joints and mobility for people with disabilities. Physiotherapist Kyle Whaley joins us to speak about extending the life of your shoulders if you're using a wheelchair for daily mobility. Oda speaks with Reeves about his self-management routine and why it works. And later we join Kyle at his clinic, Propel Physiotherapy, to review exercises you can do to help keep you strong, and Oda demos the Smart Drive. Stay with us. Kyle Whaley is the Executive Director at Propel Physiotherapy, and he began his career at Linter Center, working with people who have spinal cord injuries. He joins us now virtually. Welcome, Kyle.
Hi, Tori. How you doing?
For anyone who may not be familiar, what does a physiotherapist do, specifically when working with people who have neurological conditions?
That's a great question. Physiotherapists, our base training is a graduate program at university. And after that, a lot of us tend to go in and into a specific area of interest. And as it relates to neurological injuries, physiotherapists that work in neuro, as we describe it, we would assess, treat, diagnose, and work with clients of all types of neurological conditions. Assessment includes stuff like range of motion, strength, coordination, function, and ultimately getting people back to what they want to do. So walking, playing with friends, family, and some of that involves wheelchair propulsion.
And let's talk about shoulders. How do they work, and what makes them more vulnerable to wear and tear, particularly for people using wheelchairs day to day?
That's a great question. The shoulder is quite a complex joint and involves a number of different structures. It's not just the kind of ball and socket that we think of. The socket, so to speak, comes off of the shoulder blade, and that's attached to your upper body. And then the attachment in the front is made up of your clavicle, or what we call collarbone. The shoulder joint is not like a true ball and socket. It's more like a golf ball and a golf tee. So it kind of floats around, and that allows for a lot of mobility or movement, but what we sacrifice is stability. Unlike the hip joint, which is a true ball and socket, it's not a really stable joint. And therefore it can be prone to stress, especially repetitive stress. If we think from an evolutionary perspective, our shoulders are to function to allow movement and reaching for our hands, feeding, self-care, stuff like that. Our shoulders were not meant to move our bodies around like our legs do. Okay, so then what's the connection maybe between wheelchair fit and shoulder stress? So that's a great question. Your wheelchair fit has a large impact on the function and stress of your shoulders. So depending on how you're sitting in the wheelchair, the alignment of your upper body or trunk may be leaning back, forward, or rounded and slouched to one side, left or right. And that's going to affect the positioning of your shoulder blade, which again, the socket comes off of. So if you're slouched in your wheelchair, your shoulder blade is tipped down, the socket is going to be tipped down, making it difficult for you to reach up and function. And then the big thing with positioning in a wheelchair is, where are the wheels? If you're a manual wheelchair user, and the setup of your wheel is quite far behind you, you're going to have to reach back quite far to access the hand rim and push yourself forward. That's not going to bother you a couple of times, but over time and repetitively, that can be a very stressful situation on the shoulder.
Mm-hmm. So it comes back to the amount of times you're repeating a motion.
That does have a large influence on it, definitely. And therefore, if you're going to be using your shoulders all the time, we really want to minimize the impact and stress on those. to move yourself around.
Mm-hmm. So when you're teaching wheelchair skills or transfers, what's most important for people to keep in mind?
So the most important thing when teaching wheelchair propulsion and skills is really finding a setup, one in the chair, as we said, that's best for the client. People have all different types of body types and presentations after spinal cord injury or any type of condition that gets them in a wheelchair. So we get a good setup, and then deciding on a wheelchair propulsion pattern that works best for them. There's 4 main ones, and 2, the semicircular and double loop over, they're called, really shown to be the most efficient with the less stress. And then what we like to reinforce in the end are really, when you're in your chair, being mindful of the most stressful activities on the shoulder. And the big ones for me, those really include transfers. So making our transfers as efficient as possible. Pushing, really hard, really fast and short, choppy strokes can be stressful on the shoulder joint. Pushing uphill in high grades or angles often can be quite stressful for the shoulders as well. And lastly, not balancing rest with activity. If you spend all day moving yourself around in your wheelchair with your arms, you're going to need to take a break.
I imagine that can be a hard thing to juggle when you think of, practically speaking, just living your life that involves spending all day, for many people, using a wheelchair.
It's very difficult. Your arms, you may be doing everything literally with your arms.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned transfers, low stress transfers. What should people be aiming for?
That's a good question. So the lower stress transfers are really trying to get a transfer that's level or sometimes slightly downhill. Transferring from your wheelchair or a surface up into something requires a lot more stress on the shoulders. They usually have to be placed up higher in a position that are a little bit more vulnerable. And again, over time, that can cause you difficulty and pain and dysfunction.
And in your experience, what can people do to keep their joints healthier over their lifetime?
That's a great question. So we talked about keeping our joints healthy over a lifetime, balancing the rest with activity. A big one that we try and have people do is also balancing out the muscles that are available. You tend to overuse particular muscles when you're propelling a wheelchair. What we try and do is set people up on either a gym program or a clinic program or a home program that balances out the rest of the muscles. That may involve stretching, strengthening, and practicing transfers. Another thing we try and do to prolong the longevity of our shoulders, so to speak, when you're using a manual wheelchair, is considering a assisted mobility device like a smart drive or a Batek. These are devices that are hooked onto a wheelchair, a manual wheelchair, either under it or in front of it, that really drive it like almost like a scooter at times. And I understand a lot of people are reluctant to do that. Nobody wants to seem more disabled or impaired than they already are. But again, you only have one set of shoulders. And if you think of them as having a lifetime limitation on them of X number of pushes, we really want to spread those out and keep the shoulders healthy.
Thanks, Kyle. For people who would like to know more about what you do, how do they reach you?
We're Propel Physiotherapy. Our website is propelphysiotherapy.com. You can find links to all our social media there. We have locations in Etobicoke, Pickering, and we do community-based in Peterborough.
Awesome. Thanks again, Kyle.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
"43 years ago, Al Reeve sustained a spinal cord injury. He was 24 years old. In that time, he's learned a lot about taking care of his body and having a positive outlook. He's joining us now via Zoom from his home in Toronto. Welcome, Al. Thanks for joining me.
Great to meet you.
So I wanted to get right into it and ask you, how do you manage the health of your mind and your body?
Well, it's something I guess I learned shortly after I got hurt, that a mind is a very powerful tool. And so I used it to help get my muscles to return and to strengthen. And then after I sort of plateaued and they said I'd reached my limit, I basically felt that it was up to me to keep doing what I learned in rehab to keep myself as healthy and improving if possible. So that my independence means everything to me, and that's ultimately been my goal is to keep doing as much as I can independently.
So like you said, the mind definitely is a powerful tool, but it can also work against you. How do you stick to an exercise even though it can be challenging to do so?
You got that right. I would at lunchtime sort of take my time while my staff person was with me to walk around my apartment with my walker for about 10-15 minutes, and I would do this faithfully every day. So that just became a routine. The routine that was, everybody knew that was what I was going to do. And then I got going into community fitness centers and working at the Variety Village and stuff like this. And that was very good. But it's challenging because it takes a long, say, 5 hours of your time between transportation, working out for an hour, and then waiting for your rides. So it is challenging, but I learned that if I wanted to stay in shape, this is what I would have to do.
It's definitely a discipline, but when you stay consistent with it, you see results and it feels good. I find using a calendar and scratching it off when you're done feels really good. Speaking of tips, Al, I wanted to ask you, what kind of lived experience tips do you have that will help joint health?
I guess they're basically working with people who either your trainers, your physios, and your OTs to learn about how you can best avoid injuries. That's always key. Even though you're living the wild and carefree life and just doing whatever you want to do, you've still got to have that thought in the back of your head sometimes, like, hey, am I going to be putting myself in harm's way here? And try to minimize that. You can eliminate it, but you can try and be a little more cognizant and, okay, maybe I'll take this path instead of that path. And the other part is to really have a commitment, even when friends show up and say at the last second, say, hey, let's go out and party. Well, do I decide that I'm going to stay with my going out to work out that day or whatever? And these are the things that sometimes you say the party is more important, or the social or whatever. And a lot of times I felt that, those things would keep for another day and I could go work out.
I find preventative measures definitely helps me as well, always keeping in mind, is this something that will harm me later down the road? Speaking of things that can hurt you, let's talk about that. Let's talk about lessons learned. What have you done in the past that wasn't maybe not so great for your body?
Prime example is my shoulders. For many years, I would get up with my attendant assistants and swing my feet over, and then my staff would, if I was working out with a trainer, they would just grab my wrists and help me to sit up. Well, that was fine when I was young and able. Well, not able, but I mean young and more, my body was in good health. And then as your body ages over the years, your muscles are not as strong and in good shape. So what happened was I ended up tearing my rotator cuff. And that's when I learned that all these years doing this was not necessarily a good thing, that people should actually be putting their arm behind my shoulders and helping me to sit up rather than using my arms as a tool for pulling me up with. So I don't do that anymore.
Similarly, I put a lot of stress and wear and tear on my shoulders because I never wanted to use power assist, and I found that the Smart Drive and other power assists are very helpful. So speaking of tips and advice, what would you give? What kind of advice would you give to someone who wants to manage their bone health?
Well, it's a fine line between being able to do things easily, like wheeling a manual wheelchair, or as you age, figuring, okay, well, I've done that for 15, 20 years or whatever. Our shoulders weren't designed to carry us. And so that's why if you notice some people later in life, they turn to scooters or power wheelchairs, even if it's just for things like going out and doing grocery shopping or distance wheeling. And then they would use their manual wheelchair for around their apartment or just on transit and stuff like that. So that really helps to save your shoulders by using power. And you don't have to rely on a power chair all the time. As I said, you can pick and choose when you need to use it. Also, using aids. They can be a various things for assisting to close a door or open a door so that you're not struggling to pull on a door and wrench your shoulder to do things.
I appreciate all that you've said about physical well-being, but can I leave you with this final question? What do you do for your mental well-being?
My mental well-being, I guess I've always been an optimist. I always believe in the glass is half full. And so I always just have been able to manage myself by enjoying my own company. I learned many, many years ago, if I wait around to do things with others, I'm going to miss out on a lot of things in life. So I just choose better to do it by myself and possibly meet people down there or where am I going, rather than not taking that event in.
Right on. That's very well said, Al. I really appreciate that. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Al.
My pleasure. Hope it's helpful. Thanks.
Cheers. Well, a physiotherapist can help you get the things that you need, from resources to techniques to proper equipment. Today, I'm at Kyle's clinic, Propel Physiotherapy.
Propel Physiotherapy is forward-thinking and progressive. We like to take a proactive approach to the treatment of our clients and focus in on their goals and helping empower them and helping them to achieve their goals. As a physiotherapist, I'm the executive director here, but I also carry a caseload. So we work with brain injury, spinal cord injury, stroke, different neurological conditions are our niche. And we also do all kinds of orthopedic stuff, so sprains, strains, we have pelvic health physiotherapists. We chose the name Propel Physiotherapy because just the way it sounds. Propel, we're always moving forward and we're trying to help our clients move forward literally and figuratively. Physiotherapy can help you optimize your mobility by making things maybe more efficient or stronger, we let people tips and tricks on how to do things to limit stress on different parts of the body. Preventative measures when you're a wheelchair user, for instance, are really important. Most people in wheelchairs are using their arms to propel themselves around, and our arms are meant for reaching and grasping and feeding and different tasks like that, not necessarily moving our bodies around in space. So balancing rest with activity and making recommendations on different types of power assist maybe, that's if you're in a manual wheelchair, and balancing out different types of muscles and strengthening it around the shoulder blades in the shoulder to make sure that you don't end up down the road with any sort of aches, pains, or shoulder breakdown prematurely. So part of the assessment we do when you come in at Propel and you're in a chair is we look at the setup of your chair. The great thing is most of the time, you know, if people if their injury or condition's relatively new and they've been discharged from rehab or the hospital, they've got a relatively new chair and the setup's quite good. However, we see clients, you know, 10, 15, 20, 25 years down the road, and they may need a new wheelchair setup. And the setup of your wheelchair is really important to the efficiency of your transfers, your wheelchair propulsion, and then your interaction with the environment. Some of the things we look for is, you know, kind of what's the posture of the trunk and shoulders and head. And with respect to propulsion, where do the arms fall when you're sitting upright and they're hanging down by the wheel? We really want the hand and wrist to be somewhere close to the center of the wheel or the axle. If your chair setup is such that your body is quite forward from the center of that wheel, what happens is when you reach back to start your propulsion, you've got to reach back even further, and that sort of extension at the shoulder, coupled with a push, can be quite stressful.
And this exertion adds up over time because this is something you're doing all day.
All about repetition. There's different techniques to wheelchair propulsion, and people usually just adopt them kind of naturally, how they feel and how their wheelchair setup is. And the evidence or the literature suggests there's 4 main ones that have been studied, and there's 2 types, the semicircular and the double looping over propulsion technique, that tend to be the less stressful on the shoulder and the most efficient.
As a wheelchair user myself for over 20 years, for the first while, I didn't know about technique or that it was even something that you need to know how to do. So it is something you need to learn. Can you show me some wheelchair propulsion techniques?
Yeah, for sure. One of the techniques that a lot of people adopt in general and naturally is the semicircular technique. And what that involves is reaching back for the hand rim, propelling forward and letting the hands fall below the hand rim as you make your return to the back to the hand rim for the next push. It's called the recovery phase. So the recovery phase happens below the hand rim. That's quite efficient and relatively low stress on the shoulder and arms. There's another technique to balance it out that's a little bit higher stress, and we usually don't teach or would maybe steer away from, would be the arc or arcing technique. And that involves the push and the recovery coming along the line of the hand rim like this. And you can see during the recovery, I'm pulling my hands back like this. Is a little bit more extension or stress on the shoulder than letting them fall down and bringing them back. And the second technique we might teach or observe somebody doing and certainly encourage would be the double looping over propulsion. And that involves reaching back. When you finish the push, the hands come forward and return up over the hand rim like this.
When I'm wheeling, I do let my hands come down and then I catch it again. What would you recommend I do?
Show me one more time, Oda, please. Yeah, you're naturally using it's like a modified semicircular. You could try the double looping over. Again, push and let your hands come forward. Push and let them come forward. So you pick them up off of the hand rim. Pick it up, pick it up. You could try that. Again, we're going to look at it, see how it goes. If it's not going to be efficient for you or practical, then we certainly wouldn't recommend it.
That's an interesting aspect of your job because that's how you have to look at it if it's not for you. Everybody's different. There's so many variables, even the wheelchair setup, right?
I've been working in spinal cord injury for 20 years, and the most important thing I've learned is that no 2 injuries are the same, regardless of if they're at the same level, and complete versus incomplete. Never seen 2 the same.
100%.
I think people are certainly open to suggestions on the wheelchair propulsion techniques. Where we do get some resistance, and we totally understand it, is on some of the power assist devices, or maybe compensations that are going to allow people to move a little bit easier. There's a category of power assist. One includes the Smart Drive, which goes under the wheelchair, and another, there's a number of different brands, but you know, there's a companion by ChioCare, Batak, that attaches to the front of the wheelchair and has a steering wheel, and you drive. The benefits of a device like this is limiting the impact of constant and repetitive motions like propulsion on the quality of your shoulder joint. Whether it's wheelchair propulsion or transfers, people develop a ton of bad habits. I see them all the time. If I wheel up to a surface and don't put the brakes on, and I put my hands down and start that transfer, I've not only got to accommodate for lifting my body and moving myself over, I've got to accommodate for the movement of the chair or the surface I'm going to. Your shoulder's essentially performing a balancing act, and transfers are one of the functional tasks or movements that people tend to really tweak their shoulders on. A lot of our treatment techniques in physiotherapy, as it relates to people with spinal cord injury or the neurological population, are rooted in movement and exercise. And the amazing thing is everybody can benefit from movement and exercise. What I've observed over the years is that clients tend to cherish their independence and want to maintain that independence. And what I see at times is people can be resistant to suggestions or adaptations that are going to appear to make them less independent.
Thanks for watching this episode of Underestimated. Thank you to our guests for sharing their experience and expertise. You only get one set of shoulders, so take care of them and be kind to yourself. To learn more about the services and resources Courtry and Spinal Cord Injury Ontario provide, check out our websites. I'm Tory Bowman on behalf of Oda and all our guests. Thanks, and see you next time.